Did you know there's a Bible older than the King James Version that has been banned? But why? The Ethiopian Bible has 81 books, while the standard Protestant one has only 66. What's in those missing books? They contain secrets the church might not want you to know. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Giants were completely erased. They talk about angels, demons, and ancient prophecies in shocking detail. Some say this version holds the real story of the fallen angels, while others claim it reveals knowledge we were never meant to see. So why was it suppressed for centuries? Did it threaten religious control or expose hidden truths? This isn't just a conspiracy, it's history you were never taught. Scholars know about it, the Vatican knows about it, but most people don't. This ancient text could rewrite everything you thought you knew. What else is being hidden from us? Let me know what you think in the comments.
Bro. Melodrama much. Abu, you hearing this?
Yeah, the Book of Giants part was interesting. Is that even part of the Geᶜez Bible? I'm not sure that it is, unless they're talking about some part of Enoch, but I don't think they are.
I think they should be talking about some part of Enoch, but they're not making it clear, because Enoch, of course, itself is multiple things put together. But I mean, rewrite everything you know. Even the Enoch is really trying to give teeth, or whatever you'd want to say, put flesh on the bones of the Genesis 6 passage. You know, it's not rewriting everything. That's what it's attempting to do there.
Yeah, both Enoch and Jubilees are they're almost like midrash. That's really what they seem like. And I don't mean that in any sort of disrespectful way, but like Jubilees, it seems like one of the earliest midrashic texts, where it's sort of building upon narratives within Genesis, you know? Certainly Jubilees, and I guess, as you mentioned, Enoch to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, so this is the way these things are presented. And we're going to have Dr. Bob join us here in a second, which I'm very glad about as well. But Abu, let me just ask you a few questions here about the canon itself. You heard the canon claims there about the Ethiopian Bible. And it's a common thing. It is a unique canon, no doubt about that. And it does have some unique texts that are not found within Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism. We're going to talk more about that later. Let's talk about how it formed. It's a complicated history. Let's try to make it simple. With what you know, what can you tell us about how the Ethiopian canon was formed?
So to be honest, I think it's a bit of a mystery, because as far as I know, the earliest canon list I know would probably be in the Fətḥa Nagaśt, which is this sort of medieval, I think it's 14th century, maybe 15th century text of basically
Say that again
Ethiopian.
real
Go ahead.
slow and explain what it is, and then continue your thought.
So there's a text. A lot of people have heard of like the Kibra Nagaśt, right? There's another text called the Fətḥa Nagaśt, right? It's a text of basically medieval Ethiopian canon law, and it's a translation of an Arabic text put out by the Coptic Church. That it covers a lot of different things, like how to pray, even how to make the sign of the cross, all kinds of things, and laws on how to punish people. And in there is a canon list. They go through the canon, and I think that might be the earliest canon list for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. If it is, it's a medieval text. So when precisely they developed this canon is an open question. And then more interestingly, when you look at the Fətḥa Nagaśt, the canon in there doesn't list all the books. It says explicitly in the Geᶜez version, not the Arabic version it translates, but explicitly in the Geᶜez version, it says there's 81 books, but it doesn't list 81 books after there. And so when you look at different websites and stuff like that, or even now there's an edition of the Geᶜez Bible, which is now available to be purchased, and you can look at their table of contents online. When you do this, you'll notice that the canon lists are not the same. So it seems that because the Fətḥa Nagaśt gave a number of 81 books without listing 81 books, there's an open question about how to divide the texts up and precisely which texts are included. That's what I've noticed. So I suspect, and I don't mean this in any sort of disrespectful way towards the Ethiopian church, which I see tremendous beauty in, but I suspect that their canon was still developing in the Middle Ages. That's my guess there.
And that's important, because that means it's not, you can't call it ancient. as far as that canon being fixed. Now, do you think there's some truth to the way Wes Huff described it? He described it as the Ethiopians, in essence, saw the fights in other sectors of the church about what books should be included, and saw some of the discussions, and had an approach that was like, well, let's just take it all. Let's make sure we're not leaving anything out. It was like a very open arms, open-handed policy. Like, we're not going to get involved with those fights. We'll take it all. And as a result, they ended up embracing some books as canonical that no other church does. Do you know if there's any truth?
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
Hard to say.
I honestly wouldn't know. It's really hard to say. But the text that the Fətḥa Nagaśt is based on itself, for example, explicitly accepts Josephon. They calls it Yosef ben Kurion. It's like sort of an adaptation of Josephus. So there is a precursor to the Ethiopian church within this Coptic text of canon law that seems to be accepting texts that were not accepted within Western Bibles. But that's the only one that really stands out in the Coptic precursor to the Fətḥa Nagaśt. But yeah, I'm not sure what the reasoning was there, but it's interesting. Their versions of Maccabees are sort of unique, and I imagine there would be questions about manuscript support for that and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. But I think the fact that there are different canon lists is the sign that their canon was in a state of flux, was still developing in the Middle Ages. That's my impression.
That's what I
now. That's for the motivations. I can't speak on that.
Is this canon complete or a uniform across the Ethiopian tradition? Because it seems like it varies. Even in
that's the impression I'm under. It does seem like it varies because, for example, the Synodal edition that's being made available to the public for purchase in hard copy, it has 81 books with a pretty standard 27-book New Testament. But then if you go to, there's a website, EthiopianOrthodox.org, if I'm not mistaken, it gives you the canon list. And there, it also reaches 81 books, but it has like 8 extra texts in the New Testament, like the Didascalia. So there is this question about what precisely is in the canon. There's these different lists, and I think that has to do with the fact that there was a lack of clarity as to how to divide up the texts.
But they do have First Enoch, Jubilees, and 1 to 3 Maqábyán.
Yeah, Meqabyan, which is, so here's where it gets interesting. First off, as far as the Fətḥa Nagaśt is concerned, it never explicitly mentions either Jubilees or Enoch. So that's interesting right out the gate. Now, it could be argued that maybe it was tacitly included under other books. I don't know what those books would be. But yeah, that apparently one of their earliest canon lists never mentions Enoch or Jubilees. As for the Maccabees, the Maqábyán, it's interesting. There are manuscripts, because here's the thing: the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's versions of Maccabees are completely different from the versions that exist in the Septuagint and the Vulgate. Completely different. They're not similar at all.
Can you say why that's significant?
Well, I mean, despite the name, they're just completely different texts, and they don't seem to have an support in terms of like ancient manuscripts. But where this gets even more interesting is the Eritrean church does use the basically a Geᶜez correspondent to the Septuagint version of Maccabees. So in what's now Eritrea, you have these. You have a Geᶜez translation of basically the Septuagint version of Maccabees, and then in the Ethiopian church, you have something that's completely different bearing the same name. But where it gets even more interesting is there are certain manuscripts, Geᶜez manuscripts, a bunch of them are at the British Library, where they'll have the Geᶜez translation of the Septuagint version of Maccabees side by side with this distinctly Ethiopic text that also bear the name Maccabees. So I think there was even an open question about how many, which precise Maccabees texts.
See, that seems to speak to the nature of the Ethiopian church being like, hey, let's make sure we get it all here. You know what I mean? Terry.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot right now. Abu, I do have a question. So this ideal that someone says, hey, you should be reading the Ethiopian text, or that the Ethiopian canon is the most accurate. So basically, I can now respond which Ethiopian canon, because you're saying that there's multiple canons.
Well, I don't see. It's hard. I think there's a lack of clarity as to what precisely is in their canon. But I will say this: if a polemicist says that the Ethiopian Bible is, more pristine than you notice the video that played it used it as a polemic against the King James Bible. What I would say is I would try to get the polemicists to zero in on the precise concern that they have, because I think a lot of people today are worried about all kinds of things like Greek influence or the Trinity or the resurrection. It depends what their ideological axe is to grind, and then they'll find out that the Ethiopian Bible is a lot. It has basically everything they polemicize against. And what's interesting is in the case of if the canon includes the Didascalia, you even get Christmas. Like the yes, depending on the canon, the Ethiopian Bible can, if it includes the Geᶜez Didascalia, it explicitly says that you're supposed to keep the feast of the Nativity, and it puts it explicitly on December 25th, corresponding to the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian, but nonetheless, a December 25th birth for Jesus, and a feast that's basically mandatory, and it treats it as the primary feast. It says that the believers are supposed to keep the feasts, and then it says first among them is the Nativity.
Exactly. And first among our next guest up is quite knowledgeable when it comes to Eastern Orthodoxy and some of these larger issues. So Bob, meet Abu, meet Bob, and everybody meet Sunday Vibes, a.k.a. Terry. Welcome to God City Live. Thanks for being patient while we wrap that up. What would you want to add, Bob, to that part of the discussion?
Yeah, I was able to listen to some of it, and I think referring me to an expert in this area is definitely overselling my knowledge, but I do have a penchant and a love of church history. And what I was kind of reading in the canon, you have to kind of remember that the sort of hard and fast juridical lines that we like to draw in the West are not necessarily analogous to the way that things developed in the East, whether that be in the Byzantine tradition or in the various, what we now sort of in modern day would call Oriental Orthodox traditions as well. You have the tradition and the scriptures are kind of seen as, a continuum, not necessarily two distinct deposits of revelation. And so I think a lot of what Abu said was kind of what I was reading in this. You have the tradition of the 9 saints that came down from the Roman Empire in the 5th century to Ethiopia, and they brought a lot of writings with them as they were establishing monasteries in the Kingdom of Axum. And it seems like some of those books that Abu was mentioning were ones that they had brought with them. So to me, it seems like a lot of these writings were probably filtering down from Alexandria. They were filtering down from the Coptic Church into Ethiopia. And like he was saying, it's not necessarily that you have this hard and fast line between canon and tradition, but that they're just preserving everything that is coming down to them from up or downstream from the Nile as it's making its way down to Axum from Egypt.
Real quick, we're going to do it later, but you use the word Axum. People need to know what that is in relationship to this discussion.
Yeah, so the Kingdom of Axum is one of the kingdoms that existed in classical antiquity. When we speak of Ethiopia, as it relates to the Bible, we're actually probably referring to what is nowadays modern day Sudan or southern Sudan, which is a little bit further to the west. Axum, I believe, conquered that area, and so the name Ethiopia became sort of broadened to include the Axumite Kingdom as well. But they were one of the great kingdoms of classical antiquity that existed on the periphery of the Roman and Persian empires down there in the Horn of Africa. They'd also conquered parts of southern Arabia. There's an important war that happens sort of right before the rise of Islam, where they go to war with the Ḥimyari Kingdom, which is in Yemen, and that was kind of the apogee of their power. with the rise of Islam and what I see as the Arab Empire coming along in the 7th century, they began a long period of decline relative to the heights that they had achieved by the time you get to late antiquity. So, that's Axum is where modern day Ethiopia and parts of Eritrea are today, whereas when we talk about Ethiopia from the Bible, it's actually probably a little bit further west.